Welcome back. Now we are into our last video on the series of blood vessels, and we left off at our capillaries. So here's our diagram again. This is the capillary. You see red blood cells moving through it, and you see our tissue cells here, which exchange substances with our capillaries. Right, and recall that our tissue cells are not just suspended in mid-air; they're surrounded with a fluid. And the fluid is called the tissue fluid. So in this final video, we're going to talk about how is that tissue fluid formed. Where does it come from? How does it appear? Well, to understand that, I need to introduce some terms to us. So this is our capillary. Now, our capillary has two ends. There's one end of the capillary that is nearer the arteries. Okay, so the arteries, remember the arteries will branch out into arterioles and then they branch out into capillaries. So that end of the capillaries is called the arterial end of capillaries. So the other end, which is closer to the veins, we call the venous end of the capillaries. Now, there are differences between the arterial end of the capillary and the venous end of the capillary. To begin with, which one do you think has a higher blood pressure? Well, the blood pressure is higher in the arteries, and therefore the blood pressure is higher at the arterial end of the capillaries compared to the venous end of the capillaries. So blood is moving here at a greater pressure. It's pushing against the walls of the capillaries with a greater pressure. So what happens is that this actually pushes blood plasma out through the capillary walls to form tissue fluid. So at the arterial end of the capillaries, blood pressure is higher, and this actually pushes out some of the plasma, and the blood plasma comes out of the capillary to form tissue fluid. Now importantly, okay, so blood plasma comes out to form tissue fluid. Now importantly, we must know what remains in the capillaries. Not everything gets forced out of the capillaries. So red blood cells will remain inside the capillaries, platelets remain inside, and large molecules, for instance proteins, will remain inside the capillaries. Only the blood plasma will leave the capillary to form tissue fluid. Now importantly, not all the blood plasma comes out. Okay, so some blood plasma does remain in the capillaries to continue to form part of the blood there. Okay, so how is tissue fluid formed? Well, at the arterial end of the capillaries, there's a very higher pressure compared to the venous end, so that forces some blood plasma out of the capillary to form tissue fluid. Alright, so we now know how tissue fluid is formed. However, that leaves us with a problem. You see, blood plasma has moved out of the capillaries in order to form tissue fluid. But that leaves very little fluid inside my capillaries. So I need to find a way for the tissue fluid outside to move back or to re-enter into the capillaries. Okay, so how does the fluid outside move back into the capillaries? Well, here's how. It happens at the venous end. Now at the venous end of the capillaries, there is a lower blood pressure. And on top of that, there's also a lower water potential. Wow, osmosis has come back again to find us. Right, and that's because plasma has moved out of the capillaries earlier. And plasma is made up mostly of water. So a lot of water has moved out of the capillaries, so that by the time we reach the venous end, the water potential inside the capillaries is very low. Okay, so the water potential inside the venous end of the capillaries is much lower compared to the water potential of the tissue fluid. Alright, so there's a tissue fluid here. The water potential of the tissue fluid at the venous end. So what happens is that water will move by osmosis from the tissue fluid back into the capillaries, okay, to form back my blood plasma. So fluid will, so if we do a quick summary again, at the arterial end, right, blood plasma will move out to form tissue fluid. At the venous end, the tissue fluid will re-enter the capillaries again. Okay? Alright, you will need to know how to kind of explain that through the explanations that I have gone through. Okay, before we end, I would also like you to read your textbook. Go to the page about the capillaries and the tissue cells and read about what happens to red blood cells as they flow through the capillaries, right? You look at this very interesting shape, red blood cell here. Go and read about why is it drawn in this way. Alright, before we end, I wonder if you've seen these devices before. What are they? And what are they used for? Well, have you ever had that cuff of air placed around your arm and then the doctor squeezes this ball until it becomes very, very tight? Yes, this device is used to measure your blood pressure. This is the kind of 2GO version, but nowadays we have digital blood pressure measuring machines. As to what these words systolic and diastolic mean, now you don't need to know yet, but you'll need to know in about 2 or 3 videos time. Aha. So these are devices to measure blood pressure, and the very, very long name for them, scientific name for them, is called the sphygmomanometer. Right, very cool word to add to your vocab and to puzzle all the people around you, or to impress people with. I measure blood pressure with a sphygmomanometer. A sphygmomanometer. Right, this is used to measure blood pressure. So let's end off with this graph. Now this is a graph showing the blood pressure as we move through the circulatory system. So we start with the large arteries, the smaller arteries becoming the arterioles, the capillaries, the venules, and the small veins, large veins, and so on. Now what do you notice? Where's the blood pressure the highest? Well, the blood pressure is the highest in the large arteries. In the arteries, the pressure is very high, as we were looking at before. Where's the blood pressure the lowest? Well, blood pressure drops and it's the lowest when it reaches the veins. Now this interesting shape here is something for you guys to go back and think about. Why is it that blood pressure in the arteries has this wavy shape that it goes up and down, up and down, up and down, up and down? Hint for you, feel your pulse. Alright, that's all for our videos on blood vessels. I hope you enjoyed it. Go back and think about it, and if you have any questions, please post on the WhatsApp group. Alright, that's all.